So why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody on this brisk Wednesday morning. I'm Dr. Allison Boyer, Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I am so excited to have this wonderful panel of faculty members with us today to talk about teaching our students information literacy. If you all wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, the panelists, just say who you are and what you teach, and if there's anything else that you feel is relevant about yourself. We'll do that, and then we'll get started with the discussion. Lisa, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited about this discussion as well. I'm Lisa Kirby, and I teach English at the Plano campus.
Thank you. Kathleen.
I'm Kathleen Akers. I teach history at the McKinney campus.
Awesome. Tiffany.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tiffany Vincent. I teach political science for iCollin.
Fantastic. And Michael.
Yeah, I'm Michael Latham. I teach economics at the Plano campus.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for being here early in the morning. This was a busy group of panelists, so this was the time that worked for everyone, but it seems like it worked for a lot of other people too, so I'm really excited to have such a good group here today. My plan for the next 50 minutes is, and that's another thing I want to say, we're going to end at 9:50 so that people who have 10 o'clock classes can be on their way in a timely manner. But my plan is for us to just have a rich conversation with everybody today about, some of the struggles we see our students having, and some classroom activities or lessons or things that our panelists like to use to try and help our students become better critical thinkers, particularly when it comes to evaluating references, resources, and generally making good decisions about information. So, but Kathleen mentioned that she has a definition about information literacy. Tiffany also just put a great one in the chat. But Kathleen, do you want to share that definition that you have with us as well? Kathleen, you're muted.
The thing that I had is from the Ohio State University.
The is important.
Yeah, I always do that. But actually they were citing the Association of College and Research Librarians through the American Library Association. I just thought in part also because I have conceived of information literacy perhaps more broadly than what your title necessarily indicated about rooting out fake news. So I'm going to read from my other screen, which is over here. Information literacy is the set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning.
Thank you so much.
In part, the emphasis that I have on this is also because for me, this was a learning thing when I had taken some professional development, and I had only been thinking about trying to root out fake news and stuff like that, and it made it more well-rounded and had me think more intellectually about it, and also the creation of knowledge and that kind of emphasis in ethics. So I'm guessing that the English INRW professors here probably have that well under their belts, more so than a historian. But that's also part of what my comments are geared more towards today.
Awesome. Honestly, I just wanted to come up with a cute title for the session, so we can absolutely talk about more than fake news. Well, I'd like to start off our discussion today by focusing first on what are the struggles that we see our students having? What are the things that you all see in the classroom that you find your students struggling with the most in relation to all of those different facets of information literacy? And what do you think, what are some of the factors that you think might be causing those struggles? And any of the panelists can start. It doesn't have to be, kind of this round robin. It can be organic.
Well, I'll just kind of jump in quickly. I think, a lot of it for me comes down to students just not necessarily having the critical thinking skills in general. And I think that applies not just to evaluating sources and information literacy, as Kathy was talking about, but just kind of even in being critical readers of their own writing, or during peer review, being critical readers of someone else's writing. And so that's a skill I certainly emphasize in both 1301 and 1302. Really though, in 1302 is really when we cover it a lot. But I think just also along with that, just sort of an acceptance of sources without thinking about them critically or really digging into them more. And I think social media is a big part of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll jump in as well. One, I don't think they're any different than many of us in the sense that they're kind of drawn to whatever sources of information they have. They tend to be drawn to, kind of go back to those same sources repeatedly, right? And you're just naturally, I think, going to get a perspective when you're doing that. So in a sense, I think we're all guilty of that, right? To a certain degree, at least. And then also, I just think the prevalence of opinion pieces, even in major publications, they get a lot more, when you're scrolling, especially on like digital devices, a phone or something like that, those opinion pieces are more prevalent, or I don't know how to say it. They're more in your face. And I think, you're just more drawn to those titles. And even again, in like major publications that do provide, what I would argue are the various perspectives and provide good information, just the emphasis on opinion pieces now, and students don't necessarily know that it's an opinion piece, especially if it's from, what I would consider a major publication.
Absolutely.
I'd like to jump in here real quick.
Yeah,
so as we know, it's election season. I'm sure you've all been seeing the endless amount of political ads. So, kind of following up on what Dr. Latham just said, for my students in a government course, typically their first reaction when I, ask them to think critically about a selected topic is to follow those sources that kind of reinforce their already pre-existing political leanings, right? Because they're comfortable with it and it's something that doesn't necessarily challenge them first offhand. So kind of one of the things that I see for my students is getting them comfortable with challenging pre-existing ways of thinking. And so we can talk a little bit later, about methods to do that. But one of the ways I do that is through a debate process, and kind of forcing the students to step outside and look at other perspectives. But yeah, sources are a bit of an issue, but I'll drop inside the chat here. I've kind of experimented. I found a new website. It's kind of it simulates social media, and it forces students to kind of challenge themselves and determine whether or not
to plug this up.
Credible. So I'll drop that in and you guys can look at it and maybe, if you like it, you can have your students do it.
Awesome. Thank you, Tiffany.
I did want to also echo a couple of things, but also answer or go back to answering the direct question as well. The critical thinking component that Lisa talked about, as well as the shouting neon of opinion pieces that Michael Latham talked about. I know those are competing things. I think going back to the question itself, what I find students struggling with is, and this ties in mostly with the critical thinking, is lack of discernment in terms of what it is. And this is something that Michael had said, but it goes to the critical thinking thing and even echoes some of what Tiffany's getting at in terms of getting your own feed and stuff like that, where you're reading or trying to step away from that anyway, is what she's, those kinds of things that I think also kind of what opened my eyes in thinking more directly about information literacy more broadly is that it's a broader set of skills than just finding the best right information that you can verify. And so that level of engagement and thoughtfulness, and actually a high level of metacognition is required. And I never was taught that myself. And so I don't know, I'm not versed enough in K-12 education, but I think that it's, again, as Michael had said, we're all kind of caught up in it, right? Because we don't have a class in information literacy. And I don't know really if K-12 education in the last, I don't know how many years for most of the students that we have had any really comprehensive treatment of that to really think and be thoughtful about all of that. And so I see that as the biggest struggle, because you have to introduce language and strategies that have been perhaps heretofore completely unaddressed with the students, and do it when you're teaching your class with your student learning objectives. I have found, though, increasingly that it and I forgot to preface, I teach history, I live in the past, right? So I'm not into social media necessarily, but we talk about it a lot in class in terms of the lenses through which people view the past is also a good way to get into thinking about, well, who created that storyline? And things like that. Even not that we necessarily want to go there about CRT, but the whole thing is about people having very divergent interpretations in terms of the way that they even apply the term. It's separate and apart from that, but in terms of the reaction against having too much critical race treatment in the classroom is really about having privileging other stories as opposed to the traditional things that we've learned about in history and that we know. And students claim that they don't know anything about history and they don't like it. But then I still have obstacles to overcome in terms of what they think they know. That isn't wholly true. It might not be completely false, but it might be only part of the story. And then there are, upon occasion, completely false things too. I mean, and I have to say, I moved here from Texas, and my daughter's first grade teacher, who actually is from Oklahoma, so I don't know if she has some subversive plan or something, but my daughter was in a presentation that she said that Texas won its independence from the Elmo, not Alamo, but the Elmo. And so that is perpetuated, right?
Oh,
That is
gosh.
incorrect information, but that came out of first grade here in Texas. So.
Oh, my gracious. That idea that you bring up about what information is privileged, I think is really interesting and important. And I just wanted to point out, George made a really excellent point in the chat. He said, we also need to consider how search engine and social media algorithms direct them towards information, which is spot on. It's something really interesting to think about as well. So how are you seeing these struggles or these misconceptions, or whatever the case might be? How are you seeing them kind of played out in the classroom? How are they influencing your students' work or their interactions with each other or with you in the classroom?
Well, just to kind of go along with something Kathleen just said, I think a lot of times our students, because they are, to use the overused catchphrase, digital natives, I think they really think they're excellent at evaluating sources and kind of, slogging through that misinformation. And so I find that when I do start talking about it, there's a lot of like, oh, this again, Dr. Kirby, we know this, like we're the experts on social media and all this, right? And so I think part of it is getting through that, to kind of, I try to frame it in a context of this is just part of the intellectual work we do as writers and researchers, and you may already have some really great skills in this, or you may need to kind of, hone those skills a bit more. So I think kind of getting through that. And then, I have a lot of students who, as I mentioned earlier, are just kind of, I think, blindly accepting sources like, oh, it's the first one that popped up, must be a good one. And then I seem to have several students, and Michael, they tend to be honor students. I think this is good, who are super critical of everything that we bring up. I mean, Beth Atkins is on the Zoom, and I recall last year she does a wonderful library session for all of my students, and a student raising his hand and like questioning CQ researcher, like, how can we trust that? How is that verifiable? And it's like, it's CQ researcher, it's pretty good, you know. But at first I was like, wow, where's this going? But then I thought, well, good for him for questioning everything, you know. So it almost seems like there's one extreme or the other in terms of students kind of thinking through those issues.
Oh,
I'd
that's really
echo that.
interesting.
Oh, so I would echo that. It seems like even for digital natives, and I'm not going to be doing my, Gen Z critique of kids today kind of thing. But in terms of framing part of it, it's interesting to me that they seem to, that range that you're talking about, Lisa, is like from the super cynic who questions everything and everything is relative. And then it's like, oh my goodness, right? And then it goes to the other end where they're gullible and they don't even know what they don't know. And so because I'm dealing more with, and I have to just shoot across the bow, I don't let them go out on the web. I only give them the sources that I want them to do because I'm trying to have them analyze. So I'm just going to set that aside. So I don't have the challenges of the research things. And actually, I've had a couple of students who are like, well, I read blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that's good for you, but I want you to use the materials I've provided to you because this is a constructed critical thinking exercise. And I've deliberately limited the resources that you are using in order to do that because my familiarity, if you go off somewhere, I haven't vetted those sources, and I'm also betting that you have not either. But so all of those things, I'm framing part of that, but that range that Lisa was talking about. I think the other thing, and this goes back to a little bit about what I was talking about before, and some of the professional development classes I've been taking lately in thinking about thinking, the metacognition piece, but also about how students think that reading is reading. Right. And they don't think about reading strategies or that we read differently for different purposes. And so they don't see stuff. And so to answer the question about what do we see in what students do in the classroom or whatever, I see students on opposite parts of it, that some students read so literally they cannot see any subtext, tone, or anything else. Then I have students who, and so they don't regard historical context particularly, but even context of creation of a document. On the other end, I have students who are very attuned, like they're intuitive kind of readers, and they get that, but they fail to be able to adequately articulate what they have gotten from the reading, and then to connect the dots. And then they just say vague kind of stuff, and they say, well, and so like me trying to help them map out what they are actually thinking, the product of what's in here, we are caught up with words. And when they repeat too much about what was said in the original document or something, then they're using that as a crutch rather than actually explaining. And once again, that goes towards the critical thinking aspect of it. But more and more I see that I need to talk to them about how they are thinking about what they are approaching, and that they need to create or have at their disposal strategies in order to best consume and then use deliberatively. And if they are assigned a reading or some kind of source without knowing the purpose, then they need to take responsibility and ownership by saying, now what is it that you want me to read out of this? Because like sometimes I'm moving so fast, and you can tell I talk with my hands a lot, and I talk super fast. If I'm thinking I've already said that, and they're like, hold up, Professor Akers, what do you want us to get out of this? And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't say, because your purpose is going to be different if you're reading this whole document to get the gist of it, or if you're looking at it for persuasive strategies, or if you're looking at it for something else. Students aren't savvy enough. And once again, and I'm not putting them down by saying they don't know what they don't know. We're trying to teach them to know the extent of what they do know and how to seek out what they don't when they need it. And sometimes it's like, do I need to know all that backstory? Well, Professor Akers tells me a whole lot of stuff. What do I really need? And so they have to sift through that kind of information all the time. But I need I feel like I need to help them figure out the strategies to be able to do that sifting. And I think that is an underpinning that is more useful in the long run for them to be successful in just about any college class. If all of us are doing that kind of thing, look at what we could possibly do. But at least for them being successful in my class, I teach history, but really I focus on the transferable skills that are going to be more meaningful, because God help anybody who's going to major in history, there's no future in it.
Tiffany or Michael, anything else you want to add to this point before we get to the teaching strategies part?
Real quick, I'll just throw in something. I will say, just on a positive spin, the students give me hope. Because when I see them having conversations or listen to their conversations, they'll disagree, and they can do so in such a positive way and actually share perspectives. So that's very refreshing. Now, in terms of their writing and their written deliverables, I see everything that's been expressed, right? And I think that they tend to be hypercritical of the perspectives or sources that don't align with their preconceptions. And then they're like overly accepting of those that do. So yeah, anyways.
Aren't we all, though, to a certain extent?
I'll just add one more thing to wrap up this section obviously in a political science or government classroom, this happens a lot about struggles and misconceptions and how it influences their work and their thinking. For me and my students, I always begin the semester with a discussion and disclaimer that disagreement and controversy are not necessarily bad things. Especially when it comes to political context, because oftentimes it's that controversy or disagreements that seeks to push for change itself. So that allows students a little bit more comfortability in being able to express, hey, maybe I don't know everything, maybe I should check out another source, and listening to other students' perspectives, following up on what James Latham just said. Sometimes, and I've been fortunate, most of the time the students handle it pretty well. There's been a few mishaps, especially whenever it's high election season for federal elections. As you might expect, a little bit more passion comes out, but most of the time they've been pretty good. Once I provide that comfortable space about change and challenging your own thinking.
Yeah, those are good, really great points. So let's shift a little bit then and think about some teaching strategies. How can we start to help our students get better at all of this? So I'm wondering if you all could talk a little bit about maybe some classroom activities or lessons that you've implemented to help teach information literacy to your students.
I'll jump in. So I try to do a variety of things, but two that I'll emphasize. One is I'm big on analysis and evaluation in economics. I really like assignments that require them to create their own content, right? So they're gonna pick the issue or whatever it is. So hopefully it's something they're vested in, and then I like to scaffold it to where I'm having them do some analysis that's really not opinion oriented. It's just applying some economic models, but then really, they might ultimately pick a policy to fix this issue or something like that. And so when I scaffold it, I just let them go with that, because I expect them to probably pick a policy that they agreed with on the front end. So then later on in my evaluation, really when I'm telling them to evaluate, what I'm telling them to do is go criticize the heck out of that policy or idea or whatever it is. So I try to force them to go find sources that require them to do just that. I don't allow them to search the web, or they can do it for ideas, I guess, but really I require them to use the library databases, which again, I'm going to plug Beth Atkins. She's amazing. She created LibGuides for my classes, and all of those make that database, and that's a skill in and of itself, is understanding those databases. So it builds into all that. And then another thing I've done, I'm all about resources that we have internally, is building metacognition into my course. So I've worked with Josh Arduengo on that. He teaches psychology and learning frameworks. So I've built in that, why did I think that? And you're building that in, and I try to build it in throughout the course, build it in within my assignments, one on the front end, one in the middle of the course, and one in the back end. So those are two different approaches that I've utilized.
Thanks, Michael. What else?
I'll just I have kind of a three-prong approach, I guess, if you will. So particularly in my 1302 class, a little bit in 1301 too, but I teach rhetorical analysis. And for the English folks and others, that is really dissecting an argument to look at how it's put together and the effectiveness of the argument and kind of the use of various rhetorical appeals, emotion, logic, counter arguments, things like that. And in 1302, that's the very first big assignment they do is a rhetorical analysis. And they are not allowed to agree or disagree with the text that they're analyzing. They have to stay objective in terms of the content. And the only place their opinion really comes through is whether or not the argument is effective or not. And I feel that that exercise really forces them to put aside their own opinions and look at a source objectively, which is something they don't like. They don't enjoy the assignment at all. But I think it's a good, opportunity for them to put aside their own opinions and really look at how a source is put together. So that's one thing that I do. We also, I talk a lot about fact checking and reading laterally and checking sources across multiple, different places and venues. And I've got a couple of websites that I'll share in the chat here in just a minute. All Sides, which looks at media bias. Fact check also .org is a great one. And just really, again, kind of going back to that idea of having students, as Kathleen said, be more discerning in terms of the kind of sources they're finding and not just accepting the first thing they see, but really, doing more of a deep dive into it. And then lastly, we really do kind of hit the idea of fake news and misinformation head on. It's something that's covered in some depth in the 1302 textbook I use. And I'll also put this in the chat. There's a nice NPR article from a couple of years ago. It's about 4 minutes long. They have an audio version that we listen to in class that talks about how students often become sort of victim to this fake news. And that's a great place to kind of start the conversation and have students kind of think through those issues. So I'll put those links in the chat, but that's kind of how I approach it in my classes.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
I'd like to follow up with what Lisa just said with students not necessarily being super happy about the assignment. I do something similar. One thing that I do in a political science class is I give them a topic that they're going to have to debate. So I pre-select the topic, something like immigration or taxes or military spending. And then I let them choose, do you want to be for or against this policy? And almost always, of course, they're going to go with their pre-existing, where they feel about that particular issue. And then the next day I assign them the opposite. So, and that's what they have to do for research throughout the term. And although they hate me for it, it does force them to kind of examine the other side, and it allows them to become more informed about the topic as a citizen, generally speaking. But they do detest it at the beginning, but I've had several students at the end say, hey, thanks, that really opened my eyes a little bit more. That's just one example of how I tried to promote examining something else. And then we can go into sources a little bit later at the end.
Well, that gives me hope, Tiffany, to hear that your students come to you and say, hey, thanks for opening my eyes.
There's been a few, yeah.
That's pretty great. Kathleen, what do you do?
Well, there are two things that I have been doing and one thing that I am starting to do, and the one thing that I'm starting to do is having those more metacognitive conversations about purposefulness, about reading, because a lot of what we do now, even when I say reading though, I also mean visual sources, and for later American history in terms of audio kinds of things. Also, I've used a couple of more recent podcasts that have brought in historical things too. Not quite the rhetorical analysis that Lisa does or other English professors do, but in terms of, because our first student learning objective is to create an argument based on historical evidence, to be self-reflective about what someone else has created as an argument. So that was one thing I've been experimenting with a little bit more recently. Don't quite know if that's going to work out the way that I had wanted to, at least with the piece that I had used. But in terms of things that I've been using for a while, I've used the Reading Like a Historian curriculum from the Stanford History Education Group. And Sam Weissman, who's actually an educational psychologist, is the one that worked through most of that through a study that he had done and has shaped Reading Like a Historian. Just to put in a pitch for non-historical stuff, he is also the force behind civic online reasoning, which is something that I'll share in the chat later as a recommendation. The Reading Like a Historian really ties in about the reading and being conscious about the circumstances of creation of any given source. And so it goes through kind of a formulaic way of asking questions about that, to have students place it in historical context, but also to try to forge connections with information that I've provided to them either through yes, I do lecture bits, but they're textbook reading and stuff like that. So I still have to kind of work at the connection bit, but at the very least, them framing with baseline answers to a set of 5 questions to try to orient themselves before they start reading the historical text, so that they are aware of what they're reading, as well as what purpose I give to them for the reading. And those things are again, before I really thought about what I was doing, because this made sense to me for other instructional reasons, using the Reading Like a Historian approach. Not all of them get it, but the ones that do understand that much more about the leverage that it gives them in terms of analytical power in understanding what they are reading, and to be able to use those sources effectively in corroborating with other sources that I provide with them. The other part of it is that, again, sometimes I feel guilty about not having students go out to research, but because of the student learning objectives that I have, I'm not required to do that. And so, oh my gosh, when I was, I don't think she's here, my friend Sarah Fish calls it, when she was a new teacher, she calls it when I was a baby teacher. So, but kudos to Sarah for that. When I was a baby teacher, I was like, oh, I taught the way that I was taught. And then it was like, oh my gosh, they don't know sources. And I mean, I did a movie analysis. I thought it would be fun. They'd really enjoy it. And I had somebody who did a film about NASA and space and used everything on a conspiracy theory website that the moon landing was faked and all this. I was like, oh my God, what have I got myself into? So then I started to do about evaluating sources. And the more I got into that, the further away I got from teaching history. So it's valuable, but it was not necessary to the student learning objectives that I had. So I started to shift what my focus was to emphasize the critical thinking. I know all of us do that. We just do it in different ways, but we're all reinforcing what we're focused on with our students. One other thing along those lines is to have students really think about what they already know or what they think they already know. Because very often some things they'll be like, yeah, nope, don't remember that from any prior history that I've had. But a lot of them are like, oh yeah, that's blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, you know, and I don't want to point out to them that they're completely wrong, but I usually try to have them do a little debrief about what do you know, or what are you aware of, or what questions do you have before we start on something, because preconceptions are very hard to overcome.
Yeah, for sure. Before we talk about resources a little bit, I also want to point out that the beloved Beth Atkins that so many of you have given shout outs to already, also made a really good point in the chat. She said, as Michael pointed out, the shouty editorial content is designed to provoke an emotional response instead of a thoughtful and logical response, which is so, so true. And she says, perhaps ask students to always consider whether they are being manipulated by this kind of content. I think that is such a great suggestion. So many of you have already shared some great resources. Are there any other resources that you have found to be really beneficial that you would like to share? I'll ask the panelists first, and then if there's anyone else, I'll go to them.
I I just put a whole bunch of stuff that I had put in a document before.
Thank you.
So I've mentioned the Stanford History Education Group, the Reading Like a Historian. I don't know if there are any historians here, so that probably doesn't mean anything to anybody who's here today. Civic Online Reasoning is what I mentioned. There are lessons in there. I have to say that all of these are more for high school, but I have found them beneficial with minimum tweaking to be able to use at the college level. I haven't actually used the Civic Online Reasoning website, but I've looked at different things and I've used different like little chunks of it in my classes. Common Sense Media, I haven't used the lesson plans that they have there, but in an online professional development workshop that I took, they used some of the graphics of different concepts of media literacy in particular. So these last three are strictly about media, but they have broader implications as well in terms of digesting information. They have on the Common Sense Media website a digital citizenship lessons and learning activities. They also offer professional development for instructors, teachers themselves. Some of the professional development that I've done is through KQED, a public television/radio station in the San Francisco area. They have two components that I have the two sites here for you. They offer free lessons about media literacy and how to integrate it into your teaching. And then if you wanted to get like a certification, you take so many of them to be well-rounded in it, and then you get a certification.
Thank you, Kathleen. I saw Tiffany put another resource in the chat. Are there others you want to mention?
Oh, for me?
Yeah.
I'm going to put into the chat, and it's a little bit earlier that I dropped in that factitious game, but I really love it because it mimics social media and some of the apps that our students are already very comfortable with using. You can, swipe left or right, and it helps the students determine whether or not a source is credible just by reading an excerpt. And so they kind of start to get into the swing of learning how to quickly be able to judge that. And then we can go, further delve into stuff in some of those other sources that I listed, but I do want to drop that one into the chat.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Any others that haven't been mentioned yet?
I'll just, since Kathleen was talking about professional development for faculty, I'll kind of just jump on that for a moment. I'm a big fan of the National Humanities Center, which is in the Research Triangle in North Carolina, where I used to live. And they actually have a 6-week online course they offer on critical media literacy and fake news. And I'm going to put the link. It's actually the link to all the courses they offer, and I've taken a number of them over the years. But I took the critical media literacy one a few years back. It was a slightly different iteration of it, but the same idea. I found it very helpful in terms of pointing me towards resources, engaging with other faculty. The courses the National Humanities Center offer are all about like developing teaching resources as part of the course. So you kind of come out of it, 6 weeks later with all these really great resources that hopefully are tailored to your specific course that then you can go on and use. The cost is pretty minimal. It's, I think, $125. And so I highly recommend it. And that one in particular, I think, goes along a lot with what we're saying today.
Well, that's really cool. Thank you, Lisa.
I would just add, not to compete with the National Humanities Center, but the KQED stuff is free. All you have to do is sign up for the thing, and the materials on the Common Sense Media are also free. You just have to sign up to be a user for all of these things, actually, that I provided the links for.
That's awesome.
I'm all about the free.
So am I, Kathleen.
Having been an adjunct for a long time,
I'm going to be signing up for those later today as well. So,
Michael, do you have
I
any
would just
resources?
plug all the internal resources that we have in the college. Again, I mean, obviously by Beth's many posts on the chat, she's just provided, if you haven't looked, you should look. She's provided tons of resources throughout our conversation today. She's helped me tremendously. I find the library a great resource for faculty in terms of planning your upcoming courses, as well as, events for your students to kind of build all these skills that we've been discussing. And then on the metacognition piece, and I'm sure it's not just the learning frameworks people, but I found them to be helpful. I'll take what I think are my best assignments to them and then have them help me build in metacognition pieces into that assignment, which I found incredibly useful. So just a few thoughts there.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, there's so many amazing resources here at Collin. We need to take advantage of them.
Sorry, Michael, that's such a great idea about going to somebody who's someone else just for the metacognition piece. I really like that. I might steal that idea.
That's what we're here
and
for.
Even just other disciplines, right? Kind of building in that interdisciplinary approach, because it brings another way to analyze this issue. And if nothing else, it at least broadens their perspective.
Yeah, great idea. Kimberly Wren, I saw your hand up earlier. I wanted to make sure I got back to you. Did you have a question or a resource you wanted to share? Maybe she's not here anymore. Oh, she's here. Okay.
Can you hear me?
You're a little quiet, but yes.
Okay. It's because I'm driving.
Okay.
So I did have something to share in my cultural anthropology class.
Mhm.
I have them doing practices on EMIC and EDIC perspective when we talk about things that like female genital cutting or abortion or just topics that people don't usually address. And the EMIC perspective is always the perspective of the people in that culture. And then the EDIC is our perspective of what they're doing. And so they have to kind of look at both and they have to write it as, without their opinion or anything like that. And to really kind of understand why people do what they do and always tell them the goal is to understand. You don't have to agree. It's to understand and to respect. And when you better understand, maybe you can come up with a way to do things in a better way, especially with female genital cutting. There's so many different kinds. And so if you know the tradition means, a livelihood for women in many communities, then maybe we can only do the ones, 1 through 3 and not 4 and 5, which can lead to all kinds of issues giving birth and things like that, because you can find that common ground and it's pretty much they don't want their girls and women to die,
Yeah.
but you first have to understand why they do it to be able to address it in a better way. So we do that a lot, and it kind of forces them to understand that all.
Oh, Kimberly, you just got muted. Okay, well, thank you, Kimberly. Those were really great ideas. Yeah, you're back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so I said in cultural anthropology, we use cultural relativism, which is not thinking your culture is better than another, but we're also activists. And so at some point, during some things with regard to some issues, we take a stand on something. And so even still understanding, the culture, fully understanding a practice or behavior that has been in a community for centuries is extremely important, to be able to address it in a particular way, in a way that's more sensitive to the culture, things like that. So we play with that all the time. And in my archaeology class, when we look at an artifact, I'm always telling them, like the War of 1812, for instance, if you look at those artifacts, the British fought the Americans, you had indigenous people fighting with the British, fighting with the Americans, you had people of African descent fighting with the British, and they all did it for different reasons. And so when you look at an artifact, the material that it's made of is going to be the same, but what it means to each one of those groups is going to be different, because to the British, it was their power, but maybe to the Americans, it means loss, people that they lost. But also with the British, it was a skirmish. They were too busy dealing with Napoleon. For us, it was, woohoo, we can defend this country, this sovereign nation. They're like, please, we sent 3 vessels, move on, So it does, how we view things is different, and just understanding those different perspectives. That's all.
Yeah, no, that idea of kind of cultural consciousness and being aware of the different perspectives, I think, is really important. Okay, we have about 6 minutes left, so I want to make sure we have time for any additional questions from our attendees. So I'm going to open it up to the group and see if you have anything you'd like to ask our panelists while we are still here together.
Yes, I had a question. This is Colin. So sorry, I don't have my run, but I was wondering if the panel would comment on the role of censorship in the literacy, information literacy debate where we've seen, especially in recent years, that people have been censored, even if what they were saying was true and correct. It was perhaps that their timing was off. And so, you know, as time progresses, the mainstream narrative maybe would repeat what they said, but they had been banned for saying it. And so their credibility may have been damaged by that. So I wonder if you'd comment. If my question is clear.
Any thoughts?
So I'll jump in. If I understand the question correctly, the role of censorship in media, generally, at least I might be heightened to it because it's my discipline, but during political season, that happens a lot. If it leads to litigation, then, you know, I can attack it a different way for students. That becomes more of a policy realm thing. Otherwise, whenever students do have that type of question, which doesn't happen a whole lot, but I have seen it, I always encourage them to look at motivation. Who are the sources behind perhaps doing the silencing? Look at monetary influence, look at corporate influence. I don't see it in my course, you know, kind of a broad swath of questioning on that. But when it does occur, it's usually kind of an isolated thing. It's just my experience with it.
So would a student, do you think they would be justified to use a source which has been censored or has been defamed or slandered for what they said? In spite of the fact it was censored, perhaps it could still be a credible source because the censoring body could be brought into question. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Colin. So if a student were to use a source that was censored, would I still allow for it?
Yes.
Okay. I think it would depend on the context in terms of what the question is that I was asking the student to address. There's a wide variety of other different types of sources maybe that haven't been censored. And so I would suggest that they go to another source that has maybe critiqued that censorship. So another source, third-party source that hasn't been censored, but that maybe flagged that censorship issue, that would be a place to start. I don't think I would encourage using a censored website in my course, but you know, perhaps alluding to another resource that maybe mentioned it that is credible and verifiable through, you know, journalistic integrity, et cetera. Again, it's a little bit different, Megillah, whenever it moves into a lawsuit policy realm, but outside of that, that's probably what I would do. Great question.
Thank you.
Any other questions for our panelists? We have one from Dulce in the chat. She says, we all have biases. Do our panelists use any self-reflection strategies to make sure they almost always apply the principles they teach? So how do we reflect on our own biases, I guess, and make sure we're not enforcing them on our students?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Dulce, because I think we have to kind of practice what we teach, right, in this regard. And so for me, you know, I think as we're in political season, as Tiffany has said, you know, it gets a little tricky, but I try to kind of apply the same standards that I teach my students. You know, if I'm using a source in class, you know, I try to kind of do the lateral reading to kind of make sure it's a good verifiable source. I tell my students, you know, the library databases are always my go-to, you know, because those tend to be a little more credible. I kind of try to keep my own beliefs sort of in check and don't bring those into into the classroom and into the teaching, and really, I think a lot of it comes down to something that I put in my syllabus in terms of just teaching and learning with civility and respect. And I think we all have to kind of be aware of that and aware that we do come to the table with biases and differences in opinion and values and political beliefs. And that's great. We all are entitled to those, but we're in the classroom. We need to kind of consider audience. I try to always bring it back to rhetoric, think about the audience. As Tiffany said, think about the context, think about how you're coming across. And really one of the big things that I probably should have mentioned earlier is thinking about our own ethos or credibility and how we're coming across. So it's great to have spirited debates. I think college is a place for that. I think that's part of why we're here, but we have to be respectful and civil in those debates. And that extends to our conversations, our writing, and certainly in the way that we kind of read and evaluate sources too, I think.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I hate to say this, y'all, but it is already 9:50 in the AM, and Kathleen has already had to sign off to get across campus to teach a class. And I know that a lot of you are also in the same situation. So I want to extend a big thank you to our amazing panelists, Lisa, Tiffany, Michael, and Kathleen. You gave us some great food for thought today, and some amazing strategies and resources. Don't worry, everybody. I have recorded this. I will also save the chat, and I will post both of these things on the CTL recordings page. And I think I'm going to create a whole separate section on information literacy on my teaching resources page as well, and share these resources there as well, because these are so good. So thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you, panelists, for your time and for your wisdom. And have a great rest of your day, everybody. We still have the whole day ahead of us. So thank you, everyone. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.